What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it in Magic, and today we're taking the oath. I don't know if you've been able to tell by the marketing, but there are Planeswalkers in this new set. Well, actually, I want to make sure that I'm not giving you misinformation. Hold on just a second while I check something. Okay, so are there Planeswalkers in War of the Spartan? Okay, so yes, there are. So, you know what that means. It's time for a Planeswalker party.
Party, party, join us, party, party, join us, party, party, join us.
So today, at some point, after my heart rate goes down, I think we're fine. I'm going to bring you not one, but two Super Friends decks, because a lot of people have been asking me for Planeswalker decks. Go figure. Not only am I going to bring you two decks, but I'm going to try and bring you two Planeswalker decks you probably haven't seen anywhere else. I didn't want to do anything boring that you've probably already seen this season. A lot of other Magic channels and just content creators in general are putting out their Super Friends list because they know that we're all like really jacked to see Planeswalker decks. So that said, we've already seen like Esper Super Friends kind of a million times. I've seen it all over YouTube at least. So today, again, I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. The first deck is going to be a $35 Simic Planeswalker deck, which is actually pretty good. If I can pat myself on the back just a little bit, that's a fine deck for only 35 bucks, and that's about as cheap as we've ever been able to build a Super Friends deck. But then we're going to go full on competitive and show you another deck that you probably haven't seen yet, and that's Mardu Super Friends, which I think personally is the best way to play the deck. But we'll get there. Let's go ahead and get started with Simic. Now, there are 14 Planeswalkers heading up the Simic deck, and we'll start with Narcy POV, which sounds like the kind of thing you Google when your parents aren't home, but that's kind of appropriate, actually, because this card is filthy. There's 17 total things in the deck that Narcy can hit, including other Planeswalkers. Just for that reason, gotta play Narset. But this is also just like incidentally going to keep your opponent off of Hydroid Krasis, Chemister's Insight, Charter Course, just a bunch of other stuff, commence the endgame. Like, they can still cast the cards, but they're not going to be quite as juiced with this in play. This is also a great top deck because it's just going to help you find all your good stuff in the deck, and usually, especially if you get it late enough, you'll have some mana left over to play something that you found with it, and then it's just Narset match. You know what I mean? It's the worst pun in the video. I apologize. Now we're playing 4 whole copies of Kaz Mina because, in case you haven't realized yet, Kaz is the gas. Turns out this is one of the most sold cards, actually the most sold card, on TCG Player for a whole week because the community understands how good this thing can actually be, and it's obviously amazing in any, like, mostly Planeswalkers build because it's going to help protect all of your other Planeswalkers along with itself. It actually protects itself in 2 ways. You know, drops creatures to block for it, and it keeps spells from hitting it as easily. You know, your opponent wants to Vraska's Contempt your Kaz Mina or any other Planeswalker while Kaz is out. Suddenly, Vraska's Contempt costs 6 mana, and it doesn't sound like quite as, you know, attractive of a play. So, obviously, Kaz Mina is crazy, and we want to play 4 copies. This is the only Planeswalker in either deck today that gets a full playset, but there's a good reason for it. And on top of all of that, she also provides, like, loots, churn through your deck faster, find the important stuff, get rid of the chaff. So, Kaz Mina is just actually kind of one of the best Planeswalkers in either deck that we'll see today. Seriously, Kaz Mina is great. But up next, we're going to play a couple of copies of Aunt Tammy, because everyone's got an Aunt Tammy, but no one's mom's name is Tammy. Cue the people in the comment section whose mom's name is Tammy. But anyway, Tammy is actually like one of the most expensive Planeswalkers in this deck, but that's okay. We should totally play it. Now, just like Narset, this has like a cool incidental mode that'll keep your opponent from like Thought Erasuring you or Davrieling you, which is actually kind of a concern. So that's kind of nice. It'll come up occasionally, but mostly this is just a card advantage machine. This is one of the few Planeswalkers in this deck that has a +1 at all. We're mostly playing with uncommon Planeswalkers, and none of them have a +1, but Tammy can actually refuel herself, help you dig for more stuff just like Narset. But when cards do go to the graveyard, you can get them back, so if you lose an important Planeswalker, boom, right back. If you just want to loop a spell over and over, it's kind of possible to do that with Tammy in every deck that she's in. She loops Callous Dismissal in Nexus of Fate, and besides just running them out of cards, Callous Dismissal has become kind of the only win condition for those decks, and some Esper decks as well. But in those Simic decks, it's because Tammy just gets it back over and over and over, and she can do that in this deck too. Not quite as effectively as she can in a deck that gets infinite turns, but she can still do it. But look who stopped by, the Ziggy Bubs here, which is actually appropriate, because the next Planeswalker I want to talk about is a couple of copies of Younggu that we've got in the deck. And Ziggy is kind of the Mowu to Mahjong. That's right, you just keep getting bigger. I'm not going to lie to you, Younggu is not the best Planeswalker in the deck, but there's a lot of good things about him. We're running like close to 20 creatures baseline, plus we've got Callous Dismissal in the deck, which gives us a creature, plus we've got Planeswalkers that create creatures. So there's a lot of value to go around with Younggu in the deck, and there's kind of something nice about being able to make Llanowar Elves into a 3/3 or a 4/4 ultimately before it's all said and done. We've got a flying creature relatively low on the curve in this deck that this can make pretty big in the relative mid-game, so that's a nice play line. It's ramp. We've got like 6 5-drop creatures in this deck, so all ramp elements are welcome. This just really fills a few holes in the deck, and again, although it doesn't look great, it earns its keep in various ways. But the next Planeswalker is admittedly, like, way better than Younggu. Here's one copy of Lucan the Ineffable. Turns out we can afford one copy of this. It's only about $6 right now, which can break some banks. I know it's hard out there, but still. One copy of this, not too much to ask, and it fills a lot of holes. Simic obviously doesn't have access to a whole lot of removal, so this at least is point and click, get rid of that thing, and that's really nice in the Simic deck. Plus, we've got lots of different ramp stuff in this deck. Our last Planeswalker that we'll look at after this is ramp, just like Zhang is. We've got Llanowar Elves in the deck. There's plenty of ways to get to 6 mana ahead of schedule, drop an Egon, and just kill that thing, or like make a guy. This is also card draw for what that's worth. In the same way that it's a creature factory, in the same ability, it both draws cards and creates 2/2 dudes, which is really actually a pretty nice thing to be able to do. Just Egon is going to win a lot of games, even if his passive ability almost really doesn't do anything in this deck. We don't care. His 2, his plus and his minus ability are just good enough to carry a lot of action in this deck, whether it's, going deep in the late game and just filling our board with creatures that'll ultimately draw us cards, or if it's just getting a couple of things out of our way so that we can profitably attack. Egon does it all. But to finish off the Planeswalker suite in the Simic deck, we're going to play 3 whole copies of Kiki in here. Now, I'm still not sure whether or not Kiki loves me. She never actually responds in that Drake song, but my love for Kiara is as strong as ever. This does a lot of stuff in this deck. Another ramp element. Ramp is always welcome. We've got 5 and 6 drops in this deck. We're trying to get 2 ahead of schedule if we possibly can. Kiki helps with that. Plus, anything that's like double costed, costs double blue or double green, for instance. Kiara will help us get to those too. We have a pretty budget mana base, and we can't spend $50 to play 4 copies of Breeding Pool. That would cost more than the deck costs now to just get all the lands for it. So with that in mind, Kiara makes sure that if we have 1 of a colored source, we have 2 of that colored source, so we can hit those double blue requirements a little bit more easily with Kiki in play. And all of our 5 drops that we're playing, I've already said we're playing 6 5 drops in the deck. They all proc Kiara, they all draw a card. So Kiara kind of has her tentacles in every aspect of this deck. But on to these 5-drop creatures I keep jawing on about. We're going to play 4 copies of Essence Hydra in the deck, because this is actually like the big Simic payoff for playing Planeswalkers at all. And it's actually like really, really cheap right now, and it does a lot of cool things. Usually, you have to wait a turn for this to actually swing in, but the amount of nuts garbage that you can do with this, if you get it early in the game, pretty nice. It curves from a Planeswalker really well. If you go, say, 2-drop into Younggu, into Essence Hydra, that's always really, really nice. Or you could just go Llanowar Elves into Kiara, and on turn 3, you can get yourself a huge Essence Hydra. But of course, it works well off curve too. If you draw this on turn 8 or 9, you're likely to have 2 or even 3 Planeswalkers in play if all has gone well at that point. At which point, your Essence Hydra can just kill them with 1 swing some of the time. It's just a must answer. They have to kill it on site, or it's going to end up doing too much to them. This is really the flagship creature of the deck, and one of the big reasons to build the deck both budget and Simic. So we're going to play all 4. But while we're talking about big creatures, we got a couple of fun of 5 drops here. That was hard to say. Fun of 5 drops. But anyway, I'm playing 1 copy of Mesmerizing Benefit in the deck. I brought this up on Twitter the other day because I really have a lot of faith in this little combo. If you go, say, again, turn 1 Llanowar Elves into turn 2 Kiara, turn 3 Mesmerizing Benefit, you draw the card off of Kiara, and you get 3 different creatures to protect your Kiara. That's great. 2 of the creatures block really well, punish your opponent for attacking in, and the Benefit can swing itself and has hexproof. while you have either of the other two illusions out. So it's just insane to be able to actually make this play sequence work. But, even on turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, even if you get it, behind schedule, Mesmerizing Benefit is still a great way to go wide, protect your Planeswalkers on the ground, and get a big creature to swing in with. At first I was building mono blue Planeswalkers that wanted to go, Kiara into Mesmerizing Benefit, but that deck wasn't as good. I don't want to talk about it, but still, Mesmerizing Benefit is a holdover from that deck. In Simic, we get way better 5-drops like Essence Hydra and our next creature, but this still gets a slot in the deck because it protects our Planeswalker so well, goes wide, and sometimes will draw us a card too. But the other 1 of 5 mana creature in the deck is the 1 copy of Roalesk, which is also mythic. In real life, this costs about $3. Mesmerizing Benefit is below 75 cents, so there's some budget consideration to be made there. But on Arena, they're both just going to cost you a mythic wildcard, in which case you'd probably just want to play 2 Roalesk. Now, I had a lot of love for Benefit, so it stayed in the deck, but honestly, Roalesk is an insane creature, probably the actual best 5-drop we can play in the deck, although it is legendary, where Bioessence isn't. And it doesn't pay us off as well for playing Planeswalkers as Bioessence does, but it still pays us off a lot for playing Planeswalkers. If we swing in with this and they kill it, or if they somehow kill it with a removal spell, note that it blanks like Lava Coil and Cast Down. This is not weak to a lot of really played removal right now, so that's something it's got going for it. But if your opponent does take it down, it's going to get your Planeswalkers to, be able to -2 again if they're uncommon Planeswalkers, or, be able to use his, minus ability if he's, if you got an Ugin out, be able to use that again. So there's an awful lot of things Roalesk can do for you just if it dies. When it enters the battlefield, it's going to put a counter, 2 counters on a creature, make that thing a little bit bigger, make it even bigger when it does die. So just, Roalesk is this huge flying threat when it's on the battlefield, and it kind of must be dealt with. But when it is dealt with, it leaves behind so much value that sometimes your opponent would kind of wish that they hadn't dealt with it in the first place. A bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If you've got Roalesk and a board full of Planeswalkers, or board with a couple of guys with counters on them in the deck. So this is just absolutely insane. And again, on Arena, if you're spending wildcards, you might just want to go ahead and play 2 Ro. Now we're also running 4 copies of Evo Sage down here in the 3-drop slot. We got to play this. Again, kind of a minor proliferate theme in the deck, but this is the easiest proliferate in the format. All you got to do is drop a land, and you should be playing lands in your Magic deck. Pro tip, just if you learn nothing else from my channel ever, play lands in your Magic the Gathering deck. But anyway, this just gives you value for doing something you were going to do anyway, and it really goes a long way with our uncommon Planeswalkers. Not a whole lot of ways to replenish their loyalty outside of Proliferate in this deck, so sometimes this is going to be able to make sure that Kaz Mina gets another activation or something, or that Narcy gets another activation, and that goes a long way, and it can attack in a pinch too. We're also playing 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, comes as no surprise. I've mentioned this a couple of times, just wanted to go ahead and make it official. We don't really have access to a lot of interactive elements, a lot of removal or anything like that in this deck, so it's important that we use our one tool, which is being able to get ahead of curve and get a little bit of tempo on our opponent, and Llanowar Elves is the best in the format at doing that. We're actually not done with the ones in the budget deck. I'm also going to play 2 copies of Benthic Biomancer here. Not a super expensive card to play, and it goes really well with a lot of what we're doing. Obviously this plus Younggu is a great little combo right there by itself, but it also goes really well with Roalesk and any other proliferate stuff that we're doing. As long as this has a counter on it, then if we have an Evolution Sage, every time we play a land, this is going to loot for us and get a little bit bigger too. Don't discount that. Sometimes Evolution Sage can just take creatures like this or whatever, Roalesk put the counters on, for instance, or Essence Hydra, and just proliferate them through the roof. And it's nice to have a 1-drop in this deck that can not only churn through the deck for us, but sometimes get as big as like a 5/5 without too much work. So Benny Bees goes in, and Merfolk Skydiver goes in as a 2-drop here. We're going to play 3 copies of this. This is great after a turn 1 Benthic Biomancer. I just want to point out that little combo right there, but this obviously gives us a mana sink in the late game, protects us from Flood, which is a really nice thing. We want that in this deck. This just kind of fills so many little holes. We need 2-drop creatures really bad. This is good for that. We need a flying blocker if nothing else. This is good for that. This can be a 2/2, and it works with all of our proliferate stuff stuff. It proliferates by itself. To proliferate on a stick seems pretty good in a budget Planeswalkers deck. So this just does so much for us and can sometimes get out of control by itself. You know, it puts the counter on itself, gets a proliferator too. Suddenly Roa-less comes out and makes it even bigger. It's just a crazy thing on occasion, and it's nice to have a big flying threat sometimes. But the final card in the deck is Callous Dismissal. Now I want a few more, non-creatures in the deck to work with Narcy. I want as much as we can find off of her as possible. This kind of help fills that avenue. Plus, this is great tempo. What have I already said? We want to use the one thing we have to our advantage, which is tempo. On turn 2, we can play this, snap something back to our aggro opponent's hand, get a creature of our own to block. That's a huge speed bump that helps us get to the point in the game where we can actually capitalize off of these 3, 4, and 5 mana plays that we're making. So Callous Dismissal is insanely important, and it's good in the late game too. Sometimes you top deck this and you don't mind at all because you're at least going to get a creature on board which can be proliferated. Keep that in mind. This is a 0/0 with a +1/+1 counter on it, the creature that you get from this. So if you proliferate, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, which is a nice thing to do. Here are the lands for the budget deck right here. Pretty simple. We've got 14 of each source, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but we're trying to keep things as budget as possible here. Throw in breeding pools and hinterland harbors as you have them and see fit. It's going to up the budget just a little bit, but if you have a few copies of those cards, make sure they go in. Here's going to shore things up, but we've got Kiara, Younggu in this deck. I just burped in the middle of that. It was a real burp, too. But anyway, we've got a couple of different elements to help fix. I'm going to keep that in. We've got a couple of different elements to help fix the mana in the deck beyond what lands we're actually playing. But again, if you've got better stuff, just put it in. That's how budget decks work. Now here's the sideboard for the budget deck. Not really much to comment on here because it's fairly cut and dry. We've got Negate in there against control decks. We've also got Disdainful Stroke, which is kind of like a Despark before Despark was cool, so we'll play that. We've got Entrancing Melody as kind of hard removal, especially with Wild Growth Walker, still an important thing in this format. Hydroid Krasis is always going to cost, just 4 mana to steal, so there's a lot of good targets for this right now, and I want to play a couple of copies of it. Aside from that, Crushing Canopy is in the deck. Over Crawl Harpooner, I didn't think we were playing quite enough creatures to be able to do enough work with Crawl Harpooner, although I do love that creature. I still think Crushing Canopy is the better call here, especially with so many Wilderness Reclamations and Experimental Frenzies and Search for Ascantas and stuff running around the format. I like the ability to bust up enchantments too. We've also got Frilled Mystic in the deck as just a counter spell. This is usually going to come in against mid-range decks like Sultai and such. They hate counter spells. And note that things like Tammy can just get it back, which can be back-breaking when you use Tammy to get back a Frilled Mystic. As far as the rest, we've just got Incubation and Congruity. This is mostly a removal piece. It really doesn't sideboard in against anything but aggro, and decks that are playing Rekindling Phoenix that aren't necessarily aggro, like Gruul mid-range, for instance. Now here are your power rankings for the budget deck. A final score of 58, which is not the highest score, but it's not as low as it goes either for a deck that only cost about $35 on TCG Player right now. This is a pretty good score right here, and you get to be able to do a lot of really cool stuff, especially if you can establish tempo in the early game, start ramping, and actually hit these plays ahead of schedule. You can do a lot of work on board, take over the game and make your opponent answer you, answer your Essence Hydra, answer your Roa-esque in a board full of Planeswalkers. This deck has some cool, insurance policies, some cool late game plays, but you do have to get there, and we really don't have access to a ton of removal. So again, you have to rely on tempo, ramp, and being able to play bigger stuff than your opponent. Yeah, sometimes your aggro opponent's going to deal a bunch of damage to you right off the rip, but if you can land that huge Essence Hydra, you can sometimes stop them in their tracks and turn the game around. So give this thing a shot. It's really, really cheap to play right now, and even though it's really high on synergy and not high on too much else, it's an insanely fun deck to play with a lot of really good, cheap Planeswalkers. Things like Kaz Mina and Narcy might be uncommon. They might not cost, $5 or more or anything like that. But these are very, very playable cards, to say the least. But our competitive deck today is one that I am really, really excited to bring you. I know a lot of people have been showing you Esper Superfriends. I kind of alluded to that at the beginning of the video. I think enough people have showed off Esper Superfriends that you're probably bored of it already at this point. It makes sense. 3 mana Teferi, 5 mana Teferi. You get a lot of good Planeswalkers in that deck, but I actually think that Mardu might be the better choice. I'll show you why. Now, first of all, just the sheer number of options you have when building Mardu right now is impressive enough. You know, you can either do a control deck where you go lots of low on the curve removal. We have access to plenty of that in the Mardu color set. You know, we've got Cast Down, Lava Coil, More to Count, Moment of Craving, whatever. There's also, in the middle of your curve, a bunch of sweepers too. You know, pretty much every sweeper in the format except for like Time Wipe you get in Mardu. So this would make a pretty decent control deck. But I actually think that the wise person's route is to go a little bit more aggressive in this deck. Go lower on the curve. That way you can not only trade against more aggressive decks in the early game, your creatures are pretty good at doing that, but you can just go super aggressive and have fewer dead cards against control decks and decks like, say, Dimir midrange. And I think that's probably the better way to go, especially, here's the deal breaker, in case you were wondering, considering we have so many Planeswalkers in this deck that reward aggressive play. Like, we're playing copies of Gideon and Sorin and Liliana in the deck, and even though none of these necessarily guarantee that you play other creatures, they do all three reward you for playing other creatures. You know, Gideon can give other creatures abilities. Sorin obviously gives you creatures lifelink and reanimate stuff, so you really want to play creatures with So-So. And as far as Liliana goes, she makes her own creatures, yes, but you really want to be able to juice that passive ability as much as you possibly can in this deck. So again, we want to play creatures, and we've got access to plenty of good creatures on the lower and middle end of the curve in Mardu colors. So since these are pretty much, especially Gideon and Liliana, these are pretty much like the best Planeswalkers in the format, aside from maybe 5 mana Teferi. So we want to play these. You know, Liliana just wins games by herself. This is easily, I think, the best Planeswalker in their format. Teferi or not, I think this is the best Planeswalker that we can play right now. And Gideon might be right behind her. Just the rate on this, if you just look at it as a 3-mana 4/4 indestructible that also doesn't take damage, that's good enough, but on occasion this is going to wipe out a non-land permanent, which is crazy for just -6. It's not even that hard to get to, you know? So these are both just absolutely crazy Planeswalkers that in games by themselves, and Sorin just gives you this insane late game advantage. You know, we're playing a couple of creatures that go really well with Sorin's reanimation ability, and just giving all of our dudes lifelink on our turn is nuts. Helps us win races, but it's also a clock against control that reanimates stuff too, just helps you stay on board. Sorin is an unbelievable Planeswalker, and it's crazy to me that even with all the play it's seeing right now, in the first couple of weeks of the format, it's still less than $3. Pick this card up. We're not even close to being done with Planeswalkers. Don't you think that we're done? Because we ain't, kid. We got 2 copies of Shay Shay in the deck, too. Chandra Fire Artisan, a little tough to get to on turn 4 sometimes, but we are playing 16 red sources in the deck, so it's not as hard as it might seem to go, you know, Gideon on turn 3 into Chandra on turn 4, and it's worth it to have a card advantage piece like this. Once you untap with a Chandra in play, it's pretty nice. You know, you just basically get a Howling Mind that's just yours. You know, you get to draw an extra card every turn, and it turns out that's great, which is also why we're playing a copy of Karn. You know, the only reason we're playing this copy of Karn is to not play 3 copies of Chandra and play like 3 copies of a legendary Planeswalker. If we don't have to do that, we won't. So we'll just slide in a copy of Karn to effectively be our 3rd Chandra that's much easier to cast. Now, our opponent gets a little bit more say in what cards we actually draw. Don't like that, but by and large, we're still drawing cards, and this can even be a creature factory when we need it to. So Karn's still good enough. We'll play the 1. We've also got a copy of Egon in the deck. Just like the first deck, that's like the only shared card between the 2 lists today. But like I said, it's only like $6 to play, and even though we are playing a total of 3 6-drops in this deck, we'll definitely get there in most games. Mardu still has a pretty good removal suite, even though we aren't prioritizing removal. We still have a ton of good removal cards in the deck. Plus, not to mention the Planeswalkers that kill creatures. We've got a few of those too. So it shouldn't be too hard to land a 6-drop in the deck. So I don't feel too squeamish about playing 3 of them, especially when this one is really easy to play. You know, same argument as Karn. No matter what mana we happen to have out, once we drop our 6th land, we can afford to drop an Egon, guaranteed. And even though, again, we're not using the passive ability for like literally anything in the deck, the other 2 abilities are amazing. You know, just like Liliana, we get a creature factory that also effectively draws us cards in the long run. Pretty similar, actually, to Liliana, but we also, again, just get point-and-click removal. Instead of having to, you know, rely on our opponent sacrificing the creatures we want, we can just point at that thing and be like, hey, kill that guy. That's really, really nice, and it gives us a little bit more stretch. I meant to point this out in the Simic deck, so just take this for both decks. Gives us a little bit more stretch against permanent types we usually can't deal with, you know, enchantments, where we don't have a whole lot of cards that are capable of doing that in this color combination, so that's nice too. Just Ugin really does a lot of stuff for you, and you'll almost never regret having played an Ugin. But the last Planeswalker in the deck, and the one that really ties the room together, it's like the rug in the Big Lebowski, is Serkan. Serkan the Masterless is nuts. It turns out this was actually number 10 on my sleepers list this season, and it has already validated itself, or I guess validated me. Validate me, father, but... Anyway, it turns out that this thing showed up in a bunch of the MTGO competitive league results in Big Red and Grix, or not Grixis, Gruul mid-range. A lot of people are playing the Serkan and Chandra and Domri package because it's really nice to be able to land a Planeswalker, then a Planeswalker, then a Serkan, because you're just going to be able to blow your opponent away with 4/4 flyers. Now, I want to point this out because I made a comment about how well Serkan works with Domri. They both get the boosts and all that. And I had a couple of commenters be like, that doesn't work. Actually, it does work. I just want to nail that home. The rulings, the official rulings on Serkan say that even though your Planeswalkers turn into creatures, they don't lose any of their Planeswalker abilities. They can still activate their Planeswalker abilities, and they still have their passive abilities and stuff too. So things like, for instance, Sorin in this deck go really well with Serkan because you can swing in with a bunch of lifelink dragons. It goes pretty well with a Liliana because if any of your dragons die in combat, you're still going to draw cards because your creatures died. And if nothing else, if you just happen to have no Planeswalkers out, or like you top deck Sorin on turn 10 or whatever, this is a 4/4 dragon. You know, it's not bad for 5 mana, but when it does pay off, it pays off hugely. If you just have like 2 other Planeswalkers out, not hard at all to do in this deck, this is just going to win you the game in most games. Now, I think Serkan is kind of like far and away the best Planeswalker payoff in the whole format in a lot of ways, but that doesn't mean it's the only one we're playing, because we're also playing Oath of Kaya. It's the whole reason I wanted to keep the competitive deck black and white. I know that a lot of people have already shown you Esper, alluded to that, but there's even like Absand Planeswalkers. There's a lot that you can do because of Oath of Kaya's in the format. It's just one of the cards that makes me want to build Super Friends the most, and it turns out it's definitely worth its weight. You know, you can point this at your opponent if you have no other targets, so it's never going to be dead in your hand. Plus, it's going to make attacking into certain Planeswalkers really painful. You know, like if you go turn 3 Oath of Kaya into turn 4 Chandra, your opponent like really cannot attack into your Chandra. They're going to take damage from Oath of Kaya, you're going to gain a little bit of life, and Chandra is going to make them lose life too, so it's just really difficult to attack into Chandra specifically, but pretty much any of your other Planeswalkers too. You know, if you're already effectively gaining life and your opponent is forced to attack into your Planeswalkers because they're not attacking you, this is going to gain you even more life and, you know, hit back on your opponent. Oath of Kaya is just one of the most exciting cards for me personally in this whole new set. Knew that we had to build an Orzhov X Planeswalker deck at some point. And again, Mardu ended up being the best. I love the curve of like Oath of Kaya into Planeswalker into Serkan. That's a game-winning play sequence right there. Now, real quickly, let me show you what removal we are playing in the deck, besides the removal that we have on a stick, like on Planeswalkers and stuff. We're going to play 2 copies of Mortify, 2 copies of Bedevil, and 2 copies of Cast Down in the deck. Now, we're running a ton of 4-drops, so we really don't have the room for Vraska's Contempt in the deck, but that's okay, because we've got Bedevil here in the 3-drop slot. A little bit difficult to cast occasionally, but sometimes you don't need to cast it until turn 4, 5, or 6, where you easily have the mana. And along with Mortify, these both give us a way to just take out creatures no matter how big they are, how big they get. These are always clean answers to things like Tempest Djinn and Wild Growth Walker, and those are very important to have in this format. Plus, Bedevil obviously kills Planeswalkers too, just like Contempt. Mortify will give you the spread of killing enchantments, so it's another way of killing Wilderness Reclamations and stuff. Search for Iskantas. Just a lot of spread on these 2 cards, and it's nice to have both of these in the 3-drop slot. But we've also got Cast down here in the 2-drop slot, which is also cleanly going to take out Wild Growth Walker and tons and tons and tons of other creatures in the early and mid game in this format. So it's an invaluable tool to have. Even if you're trying to be aggressive, you have to play some removal, and it turns out Mardu gives us kind of the best removal in the format. But let's get down low here on the curve, because we're playing 8 different 2-drop creatures so that we can try to get on board. Now, I've said before, I think it's more important to go aggressive in this deck because it ultimately gives us more options. It allows us to trade with enemy creatures in the early game, so it's kind of like playing removal spells in that way, but it's also a way to get on board as quickly as possible versus the mid-range decks and especially control decks, so that we present threats to them. That's important to do, because no matter what we're playing against, we want to land, 4, 5, 6 mana Planeswalkers in this deck and have them protected. So we need creatures in the early game not only to protect them, but to present targets to our opponent's removal. We want to, say, run our opponent out of resources like Vraska's Contempt, Lightning Strike, and all these other removal spells that see a lot of play right now before we drop our big Planeswalkers. If we were just playing a bunch of early game removal, Lava Coil that guy on turn 2 or whatever, then by the time we got to our big 5 and 6 mana Planeswalker plays, then our opponent would still have the Vraska's Contempt in their hand. We want to present targets for the Vraska's Contempt before we get to the stuff that our opponent really should be using it on. But that said, if our opponent does wait to use their Contempt on a 6-drop Planeswalker, well, then we kind of already killed them with our 2-drops. So there's a lot of reasons to play small creatures in this deck, starting with the 4 copies of Tithe Taker. Not only does this protect our Planeswalkers, it protects our Planeswalkers twice, which is really important, and it keeps our opponent off of playing Sweepers and the Vraska's Contempts and the Bedevils and the Enter the God Eternals and all these really important instants and sorceries right now, especially counter spells. Even if we want to land an important play on turn 4 or 5, this will keep our opponent off of those. So there's just so much that Tithe Taker does right now. The Afterlife is going to make sure that it blocks for a Planeswalker twice, or that it can attack multiple times. It gives us a flying blocker when it blocks the first time. There's just so much about Tithe Taker that you gotta like, and it definitely sees play in this deck. I've seen a lot of people just go with the Knights, play Knight of Grace, Knight of Malice, but I think that there's definitely better stuff we can do than that. I think Tithe Taker is better than either of those creatures on a lot of levels. But in Mardu, we also get to play red 2-drops, which doesn't sound like much when you think about it, but we do get Direfleet Daredevil, which it turns out is crazy. I know this dies to Goblin Chain Whirler, but against pretty much everything else, it's a great speed bump. It's got the first strike, blocks really well against most mono-red creatures, all the mono-white early game creatures, but it's also great top deck in the late game, so it's just never bad, but it works especially well with Sorin when you can reanimate this and get its ETB trigger again. So yes to Direfleet Daredevil. I think there's plenty of reasons for this to be one of our 2-drops of choice in the deck, but we're also playing to finish the creatures off 4 copies of Rekindling Phoenix. This also finishes the main deck off, and this is another thing that plays into the philosophy of, oh, you've got the Vraska's Contempt for the Phoenix, but you don't have Vraska's Contempt for Liliana, or the other way around. You use the Vraska's Contempt on the Serkan, but you don't have the Contempt for the Phoenix. This just presents, or makes us, lets us present so many high-profile targets to the opponent that they really aren't going to be able to have all the removal, to deal with all of these things. Again, Vraska's Contempt is a card meant specifically for Rekindling Phoenix, but if they spend it on Phoenix, they can't spend it on a kind of more important target like Serkan or Liliana or Egon or Gideon, for instance. Now, we're running 25 lands in the competitive deck, and we've almost got enough white sources. We need 18 to cast Gideon on schedule, but we've got 17 in the deck, so we're compromising just a little bit, but we still have 16 red sources and 14 black sources. More than enough to get to Liliana by turn 6. And as far as red sources, that's just enough to get Rekindling Phoenix and Chandra by turn 4. So we're cheating a little bit on white sources, but we still have enough to get to Gideon on turn 3 about 80% of the time, which is fine. Now here's our sideboard, and we're doing a lot of stuff with this board here. We're effectively a mid-range deck, so we really rely on some of our sideboard here. We don't want to draw the wrong half of our deck in game 1, but we can really help shore things up in game 2 and 3, depending on what we're playing against. In the control matchup, we've got Duress in there. This is just obvious play against them. But we've also got Kaya in there. You might have expected this to be in the main board, but honestly, I think Gideon is probably the better way to use the 3-drop slot, as are Mortify and Bedevil, Oath of Kaya. We've got a lot of action in the 3-drop slot, so I will bring in Kaya specifically against the control matchups and against the mono-blue match, and I want to bring, go ahead and slide that in. Make sure that, this isn't strictly against control. There are specific aggro matchups this will come in against, but Davriel is a strictly, anti-control card. This will come in against any Esper matchup that you might be playing. Just keep that in mind. Davriel goes especially well with the Angrath that we're playing too, to double up against control. Both of these can make sure that we get one card per turn out of Control's hand, at least for some time, till we run out of loyalty on Davriel. And they'll also deal, up to 4 damage a turn to the opponent, which is really, really nice to have these two together. We've also got Eldest Reborn. This is for, longer, grindier games, mostly against Sultai, but it's also a decent anti-control piece. In a deck with so many Planeswalkers, it's not hard to get a Planeswalker of your own back from the graveyard, but with so many Planeswalkers running around Standard right now, it's also not hard to make your opponent sacrifice a Planeswalker and then get it back a couple of turns later. Plus, this is action against Carnage Tyrant too, as is Angrath's Rampage, which works in a similar way. Often your opponent's only going to have one Planeswalker out, so you can just Angrath's Rampage, and effectively it reads 2 mana, destroy target Planeswalker. But this can be action against Carnage Tyrant too, so it has a lot of different, play on it. We'll leave the one of in there. Same thing, by the way, with D-Spark. A lot of play on this card. It's kind of a disdainful stroke, that works, after the fact, rather than reactively. So we'll play the 1 D-Spark. There's a ton of 4, 5, and even 6 mana cards, a lot of which we've seen across these 2 decks that people are playing right now. So D-Spark is obviously playable, but so is the Elder Spell. We've got a ton of Planeswalkers, obviously, so we can play this card one of 2 ways. We can either knock out the opponent's Planeswalkers, kill a couple of those, and put all of our loyalty, all the loyalty counters on, say, a Chandra to have her ultimate, or a Liliana to have her ultimate, or we can just take, we can kill our own Gideon. We can actually do this for flavor reasons, kill Gideon and put all the loyalty on a Liliana. That'd be nice if you just want to reenact the story, but there's other things we can do, kill a Sorin that's not relevant at the moment, or kill a Karn that's not relevant at the moment, and put all the loyalty on a Liliana, just ultimate her and win the game. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with the Elder Spell in here. Now here are your power rankings for the competitive deck. A final score of 69. Nice. And it turns out it deserves that score. That's really, really high. I mean, you can say nice all you want when a deck gets a 69. It's still, that is approaching the highest scores that, decks usually end up with on the channel. And that's because it's a really, diverse, versatile deck. It's multifaceted, can do a lot of things. Yes, you can draw the wrong half of your deck, just like any mid-range deck in a given matchup. But game 2 and 3, you can shore things up really, really well. And even in the main deck, you've got a pretty solid plan. That said, you can get slow or jumbled starts. I'm not going to say this deck doesn't clump or clunk occasionally, because mid-range decks, especially decks that play, a bunch of 4, 5, and 6 drops, will occasionally do that. So I'm not going to say it's the best deck we've ever built on the channel or anything. There are some ways you have to be pragmatic about it, but this is a very, very good deck no matter which way you slice it. It plays some of the best cards in the format, and the price reflects that. This thing is north of $400 right now, but it turns out if you just want to play all the best cards in Standard, it's going to cost you. If you did want to check out either deck that we saw today, then go to either link in the description. The first one in there is to the budget deck. The second one is to the competitive deck. You can check those out on TCG Player. Now, full disclosure, they sponsor your boy. They do. They sponsor my content, so I got to at least let you know that off the rip. But they are just truthfully the cheapest place you're going to get either of these decks. Don't overspend for a $400 deck, but don't overspend for a $35 deck either. You don't want to spend $50 on that deck, so just click the links in the description, get them from the lowest price place on the internet, and helps me out just by clicking the link, so do that. But aside from that, I guess there's other things you could do. I'm done. Your turn. Turn it over to you. Go down to the sideboard, the comments section. Let me know how you felt about both of these decks, how you do them differently, all that stuff. I'm all ears. I do read your comments. But I guess on your way out, before you hit the lights, if you could also hit the like button, that would be really, really nice. You could subscribe if you're new and you enjoy the in-depth deck techie content. That's cool. I enjoy doing it, so I hope you enjoy watching it. Even if you don't like it, go ahead and subscribe. Hit the bell for the notifications, even if you hate my face. That would just mean a lot to me. And go over to Patreon if you really want to be, if you want to do stuff around here. Big things popping. If you just throw $1 into the Patreon, then you can vote on what decks we do all season long, and I'll let you know what we're doing 24 hours or so in advance on the Patreon. So a lot of action for $1. Get over there. If you got $1 in your wallet or on your debit card or whatever, then I'll leave a link in the description for you, or you can just go to patreon.com/SBMTG. Not too hard to remember. But aside from that, I guess I'm done. So let me know how you feel about these builds. I really wanted to bring you something different than every other content creator is going to be showing you. And I really have a lot of faith in this Mardu deck. So if nothing else, proxy it up and try it out. I really want you to play with that deck at least once. But aside from that, I guess I'm done, everybody. So I'll see you for the next one. I've been Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.